And welcome back to this Dialogue Web Extra. I'm Marcia Franklin. We've been talking about the local food movement in Idaho, and I have our guests who have agreed kindly to stay after the main program to continue discussing this topic, and I believe we've got a phone call holding. While we're waiting for that phone call to be screened, I just want to throw out the whole issue of people say that the local food movement is for the elite, that it's for the wealthy, that it's for the upper class. Discuss among yourselves. What do you think?
You know, when I first started selling at farmers markets, I was at a market where I could see the cars drive in, and so I knew what my customers were driving. And I determined after a few weeks of observation that my ideal customer was a middle-aged European woman who drove a Mercedes. And one might conclude from that it's a Mercedes that made the difference. And no, in fact, it was the European part of that. People who come with appreciation of food. Those were my very best customers. So I think we need to have an appreciation of food as opposed to the money part or being elitist.
So you don't view the movement as being primarily for people who are wealthier?
Clearly those who have money can afford it, but there are also many other people who have chosen to allocate money to buy good food. And I know I have many customers who buy my eggs because they know they're superior and they compromise in some other way.
But there is a whole breadth of what is local. I would agree that sometimes if you go to the farmer's market, especially the capital city market, that some things might be more expensive. But we have to remember that there's a lot of retailers selling local products. You can go to Walmart and you can buy Idaho apples during season and Idaho peaches during season, and they are comparably priced to other products, other similar products in the store. You can go to Albertsons and you can buy locally produced bread that's made from locally ground flour that was grown by a wheat farmer in eastern Idaho. So I think that we need to realize that eating local is very broad. It doesn't just mean going to the farmer's market. It can mean going to your regular grocery store and looking for Idaho products and buying them, whether it's in the season like produce or basically mostly year-round for potatoes and onions and breads and tortillas and dairy products, and Idaho wines are available year-round. And in fact, Idaho wines are less expensive a lot of times than other wines.
And Dave Crick, you've worked with refugees who are certainly not at the top end of the economic scale, who are entering this business and trying to make a go of it, and are pricing their foodstuffs relatively affordable.
Yeah, I mean it's terrific to see a lot of our new immigrants who have farming backgrounds jumping right into it, and they, in fact, one of the most shocking things for a lot of new immigrants as they come into our community is that they've never been exposed to all this processed food. They don't know what to do with it. The chickens that we sell in the grocery store are not like the chickens they have back home. So farming is a natural place for them to integrate into our community, and they have the best access then by growing it themselves. And I think that we have this perception that our food system is working well because we have so much cheap food. What we have is cheap calories, which is why we have a crisis of obesity and diabetes in this country. But we don't have cheap nutrition. Nutrition is not cheap. Nutrition is something that is worth investing in, and a lot of people that don't have access to nutrition end up with a lot of problems that we all pay for. And to the extent that we don't address that, and we believe that the cheap food system is addressing that, we're selling ourselves short. We're paying for it one way or another.
So there's a cost, is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
To cheaper food that's been processed.
Yeah.
That has to be factored in when we look at the cost of fresh food.
I don't think there's any coincidence between the fact that in the early 60s we spent about 6-7% of our family income on health care, and at that time we spent about 20% of our income on food. Today we spend 8%, Janie knows these numbers better than me, on food, and we spend about 20%, closing in on 20% on healthcare. And I think that's because we've pushed cheap calories. We've gotten cheap calories. Cheap calories are plenty available.
Yeah, I would agree pretty much with what Dave is saying, except with one exception, and that is potatoes. No surprise, because the best nutritional return on your quarter you can buy is an Idaho potato. Because for 25 cents, 1 quarter, you can buy a medium-sized potato that has 50% of your daily needs of vitamin C, 20% of your daily needs of potassium, which is more than twice that of a banana, has protein, fiber. It's actually, again, the best nutritional return on your quarter you can buy. So there are exceptions, and that's what we're being promoting the past 7 years is the nutritional value of the Idaho potato.
Do you get a sense that the movement is elitist or for a certain
There-
echelon of people?
You know, it's not so much elitist in that it's high income. It sometimes can be perceived as elitist that I know something more than you do. And part of the challenge from our perspective is what is the truth? Because in reality, and people are talking about 100 miles, you got to eat locavores within 100 miles. Well, if we took that true approach, folks in Boise could not eat any of the potatoes coming from Idaho Falls because it's more than 100 miles away. The closest food might be from Oregon. And so that kind of contradicts our effort here to try to buy Idaho. You know, is it more by local? Is it by state? Exactly what is a movement? And part of the issue is there's no real definition of what the locavore movement is. That's part of the issue, and it's part of the government issue to trying to deal with this. And so part of the elitist movement comes when somebody thinks they know more than somebody else knows about things. And that's why the food safety issue, we have a concern because folks don't know that there can be issues with small farms just as they could from a large farm coming out of California. The food safety is food safety.
Before we take the phone call, what's your response to the idea that somehow the movement seems to feel that it knows better about whether it's health or taste or, you know, any of these issues?
I think there is a huge information component to this, and some people do lord it over others by, I had this from my farmer and I'm better than you because I know my 5 farmers. And that's unfortunate because it's not about that elitist perspective.
Let's take our phone call that's been holding. Keith in Coeur d'Alene, thanks so much for calling in. What's your question, please?
Well, hi. Yeah, early on in the conversation, someone mentioned that small farmers aren't eligible for farm subsidies. I know we spend millions of dollars in this country to support large agribusiness, and what can be done? And I guess this question can be directed towards from the Department of Agriculture lady there, in terms of advocating that some of those policies be changed and we start to move towards helping and assisting small farmers.
Thank you, Keith.
Well, within the Department of Agriculture right now in Idaho, we have several programs that we really work directly with smaller farmers to help them in marketing efforts, to help them to learn how to start a specialty food business. So I think that there are a lot of resources. I think more often it's really a challenge to find that connection, for them to find us as a resource and for us to find them and help them.
And we should say in your position at the Department of Agriculture, you don't get involved in policy decisions regarding, you know, whether certain entities
Right.
are going to get subsidies or
Right.
not. Janie, do you think subsidies would help farmers like you and your colleagues, or would that be starting to go down a path that would divert from the purity of the movement?
Well, that's a really interesting question because perhaps we ought to be looking at what we're subsidizing and provide incentives for what we want and disincentives for what we don't want. For example, soda, not a food, no food value whatsoever. Why don't we tax it? Instead, we're subsidizing it through our corn subsidies. So in terms of the government becoming involved in subsidizing small farmers, I think that the marketplace is probably, if it were a level playing field, that's where we should be talking about these things.
Your sense about this issue? Do either of you want to comment on that?
One of the things, though, that we have seen is, as we talked a little bit earlier, is specialty crops, and that is federal funding. It does come to the state. Then it's sent out for competitive bids, and we just finished that process at the Department of Agriculture. And a lot of the projects that are funded do help our farmers, whether they're small mint farmers or onion growers or apple growers or grape growers,
So it's more
table
of a
grape
grant
growers.
program than it is a subsidy?
Well,
or?
and it assists in developing research and new varieties that eventually do help smaller farmers, or local farmers at least, to be able to grow products that maybe we hadn't been able to grow in the past.
And Leah, can I add on to what Leah said? Again, it's important to point out there's a difference between this money that's coming to the state because of the specialty crops as opposed to what's called subsidies for commodity crops, for like corn and soybeans, cotton, those kind of things. Potatoes, again back to potatoes, it's a specialty crop, and because of the large amount of potatoes raised in Idaho, we receive a significant amount of money that comes to a relatively small state, population-wise, to help fund the Idaho Preferred Program that does help do some of these other programs. So this big crop actually helps the smaller crops in the state of Idaho.
As we wrap up with this Web Extra, what can an individual person do? Because we were talking about earlier about elitism, and I'm going to talk about guilt. You know, I'm probably not alone. I start to feel a little guilty when I eat, you know, packaged food or processed food or something that maybe isn't local. I had to make that choice recently at the farmer's market. There was a $6 pint of blueberries, and I ended up buying the $3 one at the grocery store. It's still made in the United States, I checked. And I ended up buying my meat at the farmer's market because it was, I could justify that expense. But I felt bad. And, you know, what should the individual be thinking about here when you think about eating locally?
Well, you could overwhelm yourself with guilt trying to eat everything locally, and you'd never get anywhere. But perhaps just tiny little steps. Set yourself up for success. Pick one food that you really, really like and endeavor to eat it in season, and perhaps support a local farmer who's growing it. And grow it yourself if you can, but learn how to cook it, learn how to preserve it, learn everything about it. Just one food that you like. And if you're successful with that, branch out.
Well, and it can be easy year-round. I mean, just as simple as bread. Everybody goes to the store and buys bread. There's 3 or 4 local bread companies. When you decide to buy bread, which everybody does every week, pick up the package and see where it was baked.
Unless you can't have gluten, which that's another whole issue
That's
we don't
a
want to
whole
go
other
into.
issue.
Yeah.
And the same right now, it's cherry season. Buy Idaho cherries. You can identify them rather than cherries from somewhere else. And only buy them now and enjoy them now because they're going to be gone in 2 or 3 weeks. And then you need to know that there's apricots and there's peaches and there's other things coming along.
Yeah, I mean, clearly I think for folks that want to make a shift in their life, I think that the trick is to go slow. I think the most important thing is when we eat to be thinking about what we're putting in our body and what its story is. And to the extent that we do that, we can't do it with everything that we eat because we tend to eat a lot. But to the extent that we do get to know a few of the products that we put in our body, it is our body. It's your body. And we ought to know a little bit about what we're putting in our body. And there is a story, and those stories become really interesting. I think, you know, to take it further than that, one of the things that I've seen that is just terrific right now, probably one of the bigger social movements, is people growing their own food. I mean, you drive through the north or east end of Boise, and I think 1 in 3 front yards has a tomato plant in it. And it's terrific to see because it's a way for people to reconnect. They're probably not going to grow all the food that they eat, but they start to appreciate the work that a farmer goes through to grow that food. And they start to appreciate the cycle that it has. And it makes you question, wow, this thing, you know, I only got it for a month out of the year. Why is it on the grocery store shelf 12 months out of the year? And
In the case of the potato, it's because we have storage, and
Right.
yeah.
that's lacking for certain things.
Well, and
in our
potatoes are a
state.
good example. I mean, if you grow potatoes in your home, at home, you know, they last for a long time, but they don't last all year because at home we don't have the facilities
Perfect
that.
storage
Yeah.
environment.
Yep.
All right. Great tips. Great tips. Thanks so much for staying after the program to talk more about eating locally. I really appreciate it. You've been listening to a Dialogue Web Extra. I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in.